Today's topic is translations, the source text of all the English translations. Now, I'm not going to cover every single English translation, but the key translations and what the source text is. Because when you're doing the book of Revelation, there's going to be times where you're going to be resorting back to the source text. And if the source text, there's an error on the source text or an unreliable source text, that does have an impact on your reading of Revelation. So it is important to understand what is the scriptures and what are the source texts and how to find them. So what we're going to do here is really just talk about a high level, what the translations are and what are the various sources. Either it's the Hebrew text, Greek or Aramaic, but it's also been translated back in the day when they did the copying into Latin and Ge'ez and Aramaic. So we'll talk about the various source texts too. Now you can imagine this topic can be many hours if we go into every single item. So we're going to cover the Old Testament first, and then we're going to go on to the New Testament. So let's see what we can get done in the next few minutes. Okay, so as we know, the originals, we don't have the originals today. We have Moses wrote it about 1400 BC, and Malachi, the last book, about 400 BC. Now, like I said, there's no originals, but there's copies. So we have old copies. The oldest copies that we have today is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were found in the Qumran caves, and they had Hebrew text. There was some Greek text there too, and the text itself dates from 300 BC all the way to 100 AD. Now, what's fascinating when we're comparing it to the Bible is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, nearly the whole book of Isaiah, is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you ever want to do a comparison between what you have in your Hebrew manuscript today and you wanted to compare it to the oldest copies, you could use Isaiah as a comparison. And when people have done this, they're amazed at how accurate the copying has been over 1,000 years, which is phenomenal, right? Even today with computers, it cannot be copied as correctly because formatting changes and all revisions, etc. I actually used the Dead Sea Scrolls recently, okay, and specifically with regards to a discussion that I had with someone on Psalm 22 verse 16, where it talks about like when you look at the manuscript, it talks about that pierced in the hands and the feet, right? And when we look at the Hebrew text, when I was speaking with the rabbi, he was saying, well, the Hebrew text says like a lion. So my question is, well, if it's like a lion, why is my manuscript, or should I say, why is it that my English says it's pierced? Now I'll go to Septuagint, and Septuagint has pierced too. And so if you know what the Septuagint is, that's a Greek text. And it's a 300 to 400 AD source text that the English translation is based on. And so when I showed them this, they said, well, no, the Septuagint is corrupted. But when I brought in the Dead Sea Scrolls, now, thank the Lord that passage was actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I brought Psalm 22 verse 16, that passage. Obviously, the numbers are not in there, but when you look at the actual verse inside and you compare it, it actually has the word dug. In other words, pierced, not like a lion. So what that means is that some of the Masoretic texts have an error of saying like a lion, where actually it should say pierced or dug. So anyway, that's just a little soundbite of how you would use the Dead Sea Scrolls to compare old manuscripts or old words, comparing it and see if it's the same. A number of copies were also made during that time, Hebrew copies, and then you had the Masoretic text. And then one of the key Masoretic texts that we have available today that translations are based on is the Ben Asher, also known as the Leningrad Codex, because it's in St. Petersburg. So this is about 1000 AD book, Ben Asher. And the only translation that I know of, the English translation, that is a word for word for this Ben Asher, that, and you can prove it, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but there's probably one or two, but the one that comes to mind is the JPS, which is the Jewish Publication Society, and it's the 1917 translation. It uses direct translation from the Ben Asher. Now, there was another text called the Aleppo, and this was about 100 years prior to this, but it's not a complete copy of the Old Testament. So what happens is a team of people in Germany, it's called BHS. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. BHS, and you'll hear it. It started in 1968, and then you'll see there's a number of revisions. Now, the primary text that they have used was Ben Asher, Aleppo, and they use other Hebrew sources. Okay, and then they've compiled this BHS. Now, this BHS has influenced and what ESV, NLT, NIV, and so forth, they use the BHS, a direct translation from that into English. So that's where you get that from. And also, by the way, you'll see even the Catholic Bible, the latest Catholic Bible, has some elements of the BHS inside this. So it's not a direct. So even the Catholic Bible that used to be a direct translation from the Vulgate, Latin Vulgate, is not necessarily true. And there are some indications that it's based, there's some elements. That's why it's a dotted line from the BHS. My favorite, now you can't really say it's a favorite, right? But one of the texts that I really respect a lot is the Ben Shaim, 1525. Now, the Ben Shaim and the Ben Asher are very similar. They basically match. When I looked at the comparisons, yes, there's some accents on certain words, but the meaning is the same. Out of all the objections, I think there were like a 10 or 12. And I compared the BHS, the Ben Shaim, and the Ben Asher. There were 12. Of those 12, I think it was 2 or 3 of them where Ben Asher and Ben Shaim were different. But the rest, they were the same. The one that's an outlier, to be honest, is the BHS, that are significant enough that impacts interpretation. Okay. And so with Ben Shaim, obviously Ben Shaim influenced back in the day in the 16th century, when Ben Shaim pulled it together in 1525, he used the most reliable source text in those days. And so the source text that he used would have been around about some say 12th century, 14th century, and they compiled it based on this one. So anyway, so those are the 2 main source texts 3 main source texts that most English translations use. There is another called a Samaritan Torah. So what happened was when Israel was sold into Babylon, they started putting together it's not necessarily 100% Hebrew, but it's a Samaritan text. So Samaritan is very similar to Hebrew. It's not exactly the Hebrew text, but it's similar. So there was copies made from that in the Samaritan tongue, and they say it can be dated back to about 200 AD. And the version that all the English translations are based on, so the English translation, which is the Samaritan Torah, which is a 2013 English reference of the first 5 books of the Bible, the copy that's been used to translate into English is a 13th century copy. So that concludes the Hebrew. Now we have the Greek. So I'm going to move myself to over here. Now let's talk about the Greek text of the Old Testament. One of the famous ones is the Septuagint. This was compiled in around about the 3rd century BC and was housed in Alexandria for the Alexandrian Library, and then copies were made from this and distributed across the Middle East and various places. And the early church actually used copies of the Septuagint and also of the Hebrew text too. The oldest copy that we have that English translations are based off is the Septuagint, which is about 350 AD. And I believe the Brenton, the English translation of the Brenton, which is the 1844. I know there's other English translations of the Septuagint, but that's one that personally I use a lot. This one uses the 350 AD version. Something that that's not necessarily a Bible, but it's very interesting that Josephus, when he wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, he actually paraphrased the Old Testament. And some could argue that he used the Septuagint. Some would argue that actually he used the Hebrew manuscripts of the day, which I believe he used the Hebrew manuscripts of the day. But Josephus originally wrote it in Greek. And then obviously there's translations that were made from this into Latin and various other languages. But the oldest Josephus Antiquities book that we have, or complete copy that English copies are made of, 15th century AD. And so the English copy of the Antiquities is around about 1602, which is fascinating. So even though it's paraphrasing, it's good to even, if there is some kind of discrepancy on something, you can always go back and look at Josephus, and understanding it's paraphrasing, but look, is it there in Josephus's works? Is it there in the Septuagint? If you're having some questions on the Hebrew text. I know Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are two manuscripts that have both Old Testament and New Testament in them. But the Vaticanus, to be honest, it's a 15th century work. And Sinaiticus, it's a forgery. And no, I firstly need to understand from my perspective, I would love to say, these are the oldest manuscripts. And look, we have two old manuscripts, which is the 3rd and the 4th century AD, that we can compare it to. But if I did that, I would not be intellectually honest, and actually would be fabricating and lying. Also, these manuscripts, they have clear errors in them, so many errors that it's quite embarrassing if we had to even use these texts. That's why you won't see a direct translation of the Sinaiticus or the Vaticanus. You won't see that into English. And the version that people talk about in the early, I think it's by Anderson, that is not a direct translation from the Sinaiticus. It's another. He used the Sinaiticus as a supplement, but it's not a direct word-for-word translation of the Sinaiticus. Okay, but anyway, I put them in here. So the Sinaiticus is a forgery in the 19th century, and Vaticanus is around about a 15th century. And any scholar that studied the manuscripts will tell you, and you can look at other sources that I've put in the channel, as you can get some more information about this. Okay, so now we're moving on to Latin. Now let's talk about the Latin, the Old Latin Vulgate. Now, we don't have the Old Latin Vulgate, but we do have early church leaders referencing the Old Latin Vulgate. And we also have Jerome going there to be commissioned to go, and because there were some errors that were in the Old Latin Vulgate, so the commission from Jerome was going back to the original source text, the most reliable copies of Hebrew and Aramaic as well as Greek. So he compiled the Latin Vulgate in around about the 5th century. There's another one I know that folks have spoken about, which is the Amitus, 700 AD. But the one that has influenced English translations, Wycliffe used a 12th century Latin Vulgate to copy it into English, known as the Wycliffe 1384. And then DRB used a Latin Vulgate. We're not sure what Latin Vulgate they used, to compile it. So now when we look at the Ethiopian Bible, which the language is called Ge'ez, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but there's been copies throughout the years. I know that some will say the earliest copy would be about 350 AD, but I'm not sure how reliable that source is. Some say it's 500 AD. But what I know is that the Ethiopian Bible, the source text that we have today, which the English is based on, which is the Ethiopian Apocryphal, which is 2007. This was based on around about a 17th century Ethiopian copy. Now, when we look at the Aramaic, one of the most famous Aramaic for the Old Testament is Orkilos Torah. And this is the best word-for-word translation of the original Hebrew into Aramaic by Orkilos. And the oldest source text, or the oldest copy that we have today that the English is based on, is a 14th century. So there's a 14th century. There's two versions. Some was taken from the 14th century. Some was taken from the, I believe, the 15th century, and it was compiled into the Targum Orkilos 1862. So this is more of a word-for-word translation of the Hebrew at that time into Aramaic, and copies were made from that since then. There's obviously other ones, like, for example, the Pseudo-Jonathan or the Jerusalem Targum, and the source text that we have today, or the latest copy, is you're going to call this what, a 17th century. Then you also have the Peshuta, also in Aramaic, but now the Peshuta is Old Testament and New Testament. The oldest copy that we have is in the 400s, and so Lamza 1933 translated the Peshuta at that time into English, and again, another good book, a good reference. So if you wanted to look at all the manuscripts, you basically have in Hebrew, you have the Ben Shaim, you have the Ben Asher, and you have the BHS. You have the Samaritan text for the Torah, if you want to look at the Torah specifically. Then you have the Septuagint for the Greek text. You can use Josephus, but that would be my last. If I've done everything else, I'll look at Josephus. Septuagint. Then you'll have the Vulgate, specifically Wycliffe's Vulgate for the Old Testament. In terms of the Old Testament, if I looked again for the Torah, we'll look at the Orkilos Torah, a great word for word in Aramaic, and then looking at the Peshuta, another great example of in another language. And so hopefully this gives you some insight of the source texts for the various English translations. Now, obviously, there are some that I have missed, and so I'm just going to put them up here. And there might be English translations of these ones. Maybe in the future there will be, but as of today, these were just additional ones that I've come across. All the 16th century and 17th century Bibles, like King James, the Tyndale, and so forth. So hopefully this has been insightful, and now we're going to go on to the New Testament.